Welcome to Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan. My name is Joshua, and this is episode 146, Coins, Letters, Games, and More. The large audience hall was filled with nobles sitting in pairs across from each other. Throughout the hall, the roof and walls reverberated with the sounds of numerous stone markers being placed on painted wooden tables, or, more appropriately, game boards. It was accompanied by the sound of dice clattering. And at the far end of the hall was the royal presence, where His Majesty could likewise join in the entertainment, with someone of sufficient standing, of course. Throughout the day, there were bursts of joy and frustration throughout the hall. In some instances, one could see two players sharing in the joy and love of the game. In other cases, political rivals stared each other down, neither one willing to give away any strategic advantage. Any smiles they had were merely a mask, and yet, no matter how hard one tried, there was only so much you could do. Ultimately, your fate was in the hands of the dice, though you could certainly do your best to nudge it here and there. And so they continued, and as they played, small wagers were made between players. At the conclusion of their match, each player could find another opponent and see if their luck held out. Victory was desired, but at the very least, one didn't want to be embarrassed. As such, losing gracefully was just as important as winning with humility. Sure, there were the petty stakes that were gambled here and there, but the real stakes were embedded in the politics of the court. That was a game that everyone was playing, except there was no board, and the rules were often merely suggestions at best. All right, well, welcome back. This episode, we are going to close out the reign of Owama, aka Tenmu Tenno. It has been a while getting here, but then again, Owama's reign is probably the best documented so far, almost like the entire chronicle was built up to this point. We have spent about a dozen episodes on this reign, not including the 4 before that discussing the Jinshin no Ran. During that time, we've talked about how Owama continued the Ritsuryo experiment while at the same time shaping it into something that was even more directly under his control. A lot of this appears to have been done with the mostly willing consent of a good part of the archipelago. That may have been because of a few different things. For one, all of this was justified through the philosophical underpinnings of the continent. This was the new knowledge that the court had been devouring for over a century, and so I suspect that none of it seemed particularly surprising or out of place. Furthermore, it seems that Owama's actions may have appealed to some of the more middle-tier elites, those for whom the idea of a government stipend was quite appealing. There was also the external threat of Shilla and Tang, though in reality, Shilla was in conflict with the Tang dynasty up until the conclusion of the Shilla-Tang War around 676, and in truth the Tang court wouldn't even recognize Shillan sovereignty south of the Taedong River until about 736, so there were still tensions. However, early on in the reign, there was at least the thought that hostilities could spill over onto the archipelago. And then there are all of the projects, the designation of national temples, the beginning of a national history project, the founding of a permanent capital city, and the creation of a formal code, the Asuka Kyomihara Code. Compared to all of that, well, the topics of this episode really are some miscellaneous stuff that I didn't have anywhere else to put, but wanted to bring to light anyway. First, we'll talk about the minting of coins and what that meant. Once again, this is really neat because we have some actual coins that appear to be from this time, providing what might be a direct relationship between what is written down and what we have in the archaeological record. And then we'll touch on another project of Owama's, this one less successful than some of the others we've discussed. This was an attempt to create a new writing system specific to the Japanese language. Remember, at this point, literate people in the archipelago were using kanji to write everything down, and for the most part, they were using kanbun, so Sinitic characters and grammar, with occasional use of characters purely for the phonetic qualities when they absolutely had to spell something out. Eventually, this would evolve into the syllabaries of katakana and hiragana, but there were several false starts before that, and we'll talk about what was being attempted during Owama's reign. Beyond those court projects, we'll talk about some of the kami and Buddhist-related rituals, especially as they related to growing merit and attempting to protect the state and its people from disasters, natural or otherwise. And then there were various omens and just a few edicts that were more geared towards the court but are still fun. Like when Owama forced the entire court to join him for a day of board games. I guess when you're the sovereign and trying to set up game day, scheduling is suddenly not so big of a problem. So that's what we're going to cover. We are skipping around throughout the reign, and so while I mention dates here and there, I'll try not to get too bogged down with the exact dates unless it really matters. So first off, coins. We are going to start somewhere in the middle on the 15th day of the 4th month of 683. It's here that we see a note that Owama decreed that copper coins would be used and not silver. Remember, a silver mine had been discovered in Tsushima back in 674. At that time, we know that there were silver coins being made, but in 683 it looks like they were changing from silver to copper. However, 3 days later, they reversed the decision to completely cancel the silver coins, so they presumably had both silver and copper coins in circulation. Coins are interesting for several reasons. For one, coins often help us to date various collections, if they're distinctive enough, that is. They can be quite helpful in telling us that a particular archaeological assemblage is almost certainly from sometime after the coins had begun to be circulated. After all, if you unearth a stratum of archaeological dig and you find a penny dated to 1912, you can be reasonably confident that that layer was last exposed on or after 1912, unless time travel was at play. There are some exceptions where animals or tree roots or other forces can disturb the layering, but that's why archaeologists carefully pay attention to soil features. That isn't to say that all coins of the time had clear dates on them. In fact, the oldest coins we have that appear to have been made in the archipelago are something called Mumon Ginsen, literally unmarked silver coins. They are found in various assemblages and thought to have originated under Nakano Oe, aka Tenji Tenno. The silver from Tsushima would have likely been used for something like this. For many reasons, it is unclear if these were minted by the state or if they were privately minted and circulated. Now, the copper coin mentioned in Owama's record in the Nihon Shoki would appear to be what is known as a Fuhonsen coin, which we also have extant examples of. These are round copper coins with a square hole in the middle, as was common on the continent. The previous unmarked silver coins were just small circles of solid silver. In contrast, the Fuhonsen bears the characters Fuhon. Fu or tomi means wealth, and hon or moto means something like base or basis. Sen just refers to the fact that it's a coin. So the coin represents the basis of wealth. They are just under an inch in diameter and 1.5 millimeters thick. While primarily copper, they do have traces of antimony, silver, and bismuth. The use of copper was likely because of its lower melting point, which would have been easier to cast with. So it seems that these were the new copper coins mentioned in the Chronicles, and the intent was originally to completely replace any silver currency. I suspect that they quickly realized they could not easily replace all the silver, and so the older silver coins were probably still in circulation, as I said, though I don't know if any new ones were being minted at this time. We don't exactly know how the coins were used. They weren't being used to pay taxes or similar things as far as we can tell. That was still being handled in rice, silk, cloth, and labor. They might have been used by the government to pay individuals who then exchanged them for goods, but they were probably not used very often between individuals. There's even some suggestion that they had a more ritual meaning. Coins of a similar shape, round with a square hole in the center, go back to at least 350 BCE on the continent and were quite common by the time of the Han Dynasty. The hole in the middle allowed them to be placed on strings, and you'll often see references to strings of cash. In the Qin Dynasty, a string was meant to be a super unit made up of 1,000 coins. So 1,000 coins literally on a piece of string, and merchants and others operating at some scale could then just pay in strings of cash rather than counting out each and every coin. It also provided a way of transporting them. Anyone doing business in East Asia would have encountered coinage from one of the dynasties on the mainland, and we certainly see various coins making their way over to the archipelago, though how exactly they were used and valued isn't certain. It may have been more important to just have them on hand for trips to the continent so that an embassy or trading vessel could participate in the economy over there. Now, the next coin to be minted in the archipelago itself wasn't until 708, and that was the Wado Kaichin, or Wado coins, named for the 4 characters around the square hole, which included the era name that they were created, Wado. This seems to have kicked off an actual national currency that would only last for a couple hundred years before it was debased and lost its value. For centuries after that, rice was once again the primary currency, and would continue to be so even though the Tokugawa shogunate would begin to mint and issue coins through much of their rule. Still, coins were often outside the grasp of most of the common people. While coins may not have fully caught on, they did better than our next project. This was a task that was given to Sakaibe no Muraji no Iwashiki, who compiled by royal command a new set of characters which were recorded in a book of 44 volumes. Though this book is no longer extant, we do have later sources that claim it was once in the royal library. It is described as having characters similar to Sanskrit characters. Now, this appears to be an attempt to create an alphabet or syllabary for the Japanese language. While Yamato had adopted the Sinitic system of logographic writing, it wasn't exactly up to the task of directly writing in Japanese. For one thing, the languages had different sounds that they used and in different combinations. Furthermore, grammatically, the two were quite different. Many Sinitic languages are subject-verb-object, similar to English, while Japanese is subject-object-verb, meaning the verb goes at the very end. But beyond that, Japanese relies extensively on conjugation of verbs, with verbs and adjectives changing to express tense and other such things that Sinitic languages such as modern Putonghua and languages such as Middle Chinese handled in other ways. To give an English-speaking person a similar experience, imagine writing sentences as, "the bird in the tree sat," or "the man the bread at the store bought." Now remove many of the articles and prepositions so you get things like bird, tree, sit, and man, bread, store, buy. You can imagine how that can get really unwieldy if you want to convey more nuanced concepts. And the fact that you have to translate from the one language into another, it just proved difficult. Now, Japanese would either need to add a phonetic writing system, which it eventually did, or it would need to come up with new characters to use in place of the special qualities of the language. Or they would need to continue to write in Sinitic grammatical order and continue to do the translation to Japanese on the fly. One can imagine this was hardly efficient. In order to learn how to write, you basically had to learn a whole other language. That these new symbols were similar to characters associated with Sanskrit also makes sense, and we even see similar attempts on the continent, though they also had other writing systems to compare to as well. For example, we see Persian Sogdian written with a variation of the Syriac script, and the Gandhari language written with its own Gandhari or Kharoshthi script. But the influence of Buddhism likely explains why scripts associated with Sanskrit likely had a greater influence than other languages. I should note here that Sanskrit itself does not have a single script. Today, people probably think of the Devanagari script commonly used in India, but that doesn't seem to have been developed until the 8th century. The work of Iwashiki was likely based on something like the Siddham or Kutila script. This is an abugida, where consonants and vowels are connected together when written. This would have worked well for Japanese language, as phonemes are often grouped together as consonant-vowel clusters known as morae. Siddham evolved in the late 6th century, and many Buddhist scripts were making their way along the Silk Road and would have used it or something similar. However, it is said that Siddham proper, or at least as far as we know it today, was only introduced to Japan by the famous monk Kukai in the 9th century. If that is the case, then what script was Iwashiki using as his inspiration? Well, regardless of the details, this new script doesn't seem to have taken off. It may have just been too much to ask someone to learn the various kanji and another system on top of that. Instead, the Japanese would adapt certain kanji over time and simplify them into what we know today as kana. Our earliest example is what we know of as Manyō-gana, named for the Manyōshū, an 8th century collection of poems attributed to various contemporary and historical figures. Because the poetic structure of Japanese required specific counts of syllables, or more specifically morae, it was important to capture the actual pronunciation of the language. Certain characters were chosen and used over and over, again, purely for their phonetic value rather than any other inherent meaning. Over time, those characters were simplified and standardized, developing into the katakana and hiragana still used today. While it was these organically evolving systems that would eventually be most popular and fill the gap, it is still incredible to see someone deliberately tackling the problem at this very early date. Now, moving on from money and writing, let's turn now to matters of the kami and the Buddha. Yamato existed in a world that saw itself as being caught between forces both seen and unseen, Besides the natural world, there was the spiritual world, and to many, it was just as real as anything else. We've talked all along about the interplay between the court, the kami, and the Buddha, and some of the evidence we see is relatively simple. For instance, in 675, the O Kami, the great god of Tosa, presented a divine sword to the sovereign. I doubt a kami was showing up in person to the court. That would have been priests from the shrine. Aston suggests that the kami in question was probably either Hitokoto Nushi no Mikoto or Misukitaka Hikone no Mikoto. He's quoting here authorities which he does not otherwise name, so not quite sure where he's getting that, but there you go. We get more serious, though, when it comes to major events, and the drought and famine of 676 really seems to fit that description. As you may recall from episode 144, the governor of Shimotsugeno related a report of a bad harvest in the 5th month, and by the 6th month, we see more reports coming in of a great drought. Clothing was collected for Buddhist temples to help build merit. And later, there was a comet in the sky, and then in the 8th month, we see that the court compelled the Kuni no Miyatsuko and the governors to all contribute to an oharai, or great purification. Now, eventually, the oharai would become a regular ceremony held on the 30th day of the 6th and 12th months of each year, with royal princes down to the high ministers gathering at the southern gate, the Suzakumon. Members of the Urabe, the diviners, would read the various norito, the ritual prayers, to disperse evil influences. It was and is also used when there is a royal visit to the Ise or Kamo shrines, as well as at the Dajosai festival at the start of a new reign. It can also be done if there's thought to have been some kind of offense that was committed. Harai, or purification, is a common part of Shinto ritual today. From the simple washing of the hands and mouth before entering the shrine grounds to pray, to spiritual purification performed by a priest who waves a large stick with paper streamers, the onusa or harai gushi, while chanting prayers to ward off evil influences, purification is a key component in Shinto, which often concerns itself with aspects of spiritual pollution. And so the oharai, the great purification, is just that, but turned up to 11. The litany used for oharai today is also known as the Nakatomi no oharai, indicating the importance of the Nakatomi in this ritual from an early date. The oharai, however, was taking place in the 8th month and may not have had all of the traditions of later rituals as we know it today. Rather, we are told what was required. The Kuni no Miyatsuko of the provinces were instructed to send one horse and a piece of cloth to specific shrines, specifically designated to purification. In addition, the governors of the various districts were each told to supply one sword, one deerskin, one mattock, one smaller sword, one sickle, one set of arrows, and one sheaf of rice. In addition, each household had to supply a bundle of hemp cloth. These may not have been used in the ritual as much as they were offerings to the kami and their shrine. We'll see this in various cases where the state places rather onerous financial requirements on the population in order to perform these kinds of national rituals. Of course, by the logic of the time, whatever was donated would just make the ritual more effective. It would be more pleasing to the kami. Still, this seems remarkably costly in a year where we are told that the peasants were starving just a few months prior. I'll also take this moment to point out a link here to something that anyone who's been to a shrine may be familiar with, and that is the donation of horses. Now, horses were common enough as a donation. If people of status rode horses, then how much more so the kami themselves? Sacred or votive horses could be used to carry the kami, and even today, some shrines keep sacred horses specifically for the kami to use. However, not everyone has horses to donate, and I suspect that the shrine probably didn't need an entire herd of horses. And so, some would instead pay money for an image of a horse instead to be hung in the shrine, likely indicating the donor. Of course, this wasn't just a picture, but an official record of some kind of donation, which could theoretically go on to purchase horses and other such things that the shrine might need. After all, the roof is broken. Horse isn't going to be nearly as good as some of those copper coins we talked about earlier. Yeah, I think I'll take those instead. Now, these pictures of horses were known as ema, literally picture horse, and we still see them today. The most common type of ema will be small wooden placards sold at the shrine, and people will write their desires on the back with their name and information. They'll often be found hanging in groups on specifically designated racks meant for that purpose. Today, an ema might have horses on them, but more often they have other pictures associated with the particular shrine and kami, but they are still called ema, picture horse. Speaking of horses, we have a couple more references to them this year. At some point, Owama had issued an edict seeking horses, not just for riding, but other good horses so that the government would have them when needed, and they were distributed to various post stations. So when Owama was returning from a banquet by the Todoroki pool in Hase, Owama made a diversion to the post station of Tomi and had the horses demonstrate their speed. Presumably this was just a horse race, which seems to be popular around the world in any place that has horses or really anything that runs fast, or sometimes just people. You know, we like to see things go fast, I guess. We see something similar when we're told that Owama went to Asatsuma to inspect the horses of the officials there. At his request, the officials organized a competition of horseback archery. This appears to be reference to the famous art of Yabusame, though it may not have been recognized as such just yet. There is some thought that the idea of a horsed archer shooting at 3 targets while galloping past may have originated as early as the 6th century, with ties to Usajingu. Still, horseback archery would remain important, and later it would become the primary art of the warrior class from about the 12th to the 13th century or so, and arguably even up until the Sengoku period, with its spear formations and foreign guns. Later, in the 10th lunar month of 681, Owama and the court were prepared to go hunting on the Hirose plain, once again bringing out their horses. A temporary palace was prepared and all the bags were packed, but ultimately, Owama didn't go. Instead, those from the rank of prince to high minister stayed in Karunoichi, a market at a crossroads in the Nara Basin that was likely also the location of a government stable. There they inspected the horses and saddle equipment. Those from the rank of shokin on up sat under the trees, while those of the rank of daisen and below mounted up and passed along from south to north. Not quite as exciting as horse racing or horsed archery, but hey, who doesn't like a parade? And one wonders what happened to call off the hunt. Perhaps Owama, while not exactly bedridden, was not in the best of health. If he was having some kind of recurring problems, then that could explain some of the merit making as well. You may recall we discussed how much merit the state seemed to be trying to make in support of the sovereign's health when we discussed in episode 142 how all of this was happening. Now, getting back to the Oharai, the Great Purification, that was followed up by a general amnesty, which we talked about last episode, as well as a command to let loose living things. Now, this is a Buddhist practice that one still sees today in various places, usually in the form of letting loose animals like fish and birds that were kept by individuals. I don't think they were just opening up the paddocks and letting the horses, cattle, and other animals go free. As fascinating as that might be to contemplate, with horses just running wild and cattle trampling the rice fields, I doubt they took it that far. Still, this practice was clearly an attempt to make more merit for the state. This edict was repeated only a few months later in the 11th lunar month, but then it was confined to those provinces that were considered to be near to the capital, so a little more focused. The day after the second release of animals, men were dispatched to all parts to expound the Konkwomyo and Ninno Sutras. Now, this was the Sutra of Golden Light and the Sutra of the Benevolent King. Both sutras focused on concepts of good rulership and protection of the state. In fact, together with the Lotus Sutra, they would come to be considered the Gokoku Sambukyo, the 3 sutras for the protection of the state. They were read specifically for the purpose of averting disaster, but they also helped to prop up the image of a righteous and benevolent ruler, what might be termed a golden wheel turning sovereign or Chakravarti. So all of this would seem to be simultaneously reflecting on an intention to protect the state while also demonstrating performative regnal righteousness. It was, after all, what a good ruler was supposed to do, which also conveniently told people what a good ruler was supposed to do. It's unclear whether or not the court actually felt that it did anything. I would note that a month later, they were asking princes and ministers to gather up weapons, so It's possible that they were concerned about more than just natural disasters, such as a concern that the people were getting restless. A few days later, we see more largesse as the court made presents to public functionaries and men of the frontier states. It's unclear to me if this is a reward of some sort or perhaps just an attempt to boost their morale and support and loyalty to the court. Later in that month, we see preparations for the upcoming Feast of First Fruits, or Ni Namisai. We're told that the Jingi Khan, the Office of Kami Matters, had made the divination that the Yuki, the ceremonially pure rice for the ritual, would come from the district of Yamada in Owari. For the Sugi, the next lower quality of rice, well, that would come from the district of Kasa in Tamba. The feast went off as usual in the 11th month, preempting the normal announcement of the first of the month. Later in the record, we see preparations were started for another Oharai, or Great Purification, and another general amnesty was issued. This time, instead of sending horses for the kami, the Miyatsuko of each province were to supply one male and one female servant to the shrines instead. 15 days later, in the intercalary 7th lunar month, an extra month inserted to keep the lunar and solar calendars in sync, we see the Queen Uno hosting a feast after ritual fasting. She then had sutras expounded throughout the capital. I find it particularly interesting that this was apparently instigated by the Queen, but along with the Oharai, this all speaks towards the feeling that the state needed to be purified and supplied with good amount of merit. The Oharai was not the only way to curry favor with the kami. For example, in one record, we see Oama designating sacred tax rice for the shrines of heaven and earth, shrines for the Amatsu kami and Kunitsu kami. 1/3 of the rice was to go to the kami directly, while 2/3 of the rice was to go to the priests who kept the shrines going. This same year, 677, we aren't told where the rice for the Ni Namesai came from, but we are told that those who donated, as well as members of the Jingi Khan who were involved in the divination and ritual more generally, were all compensated for their troubles with various presents. Now, the Jingi Khan is one of those aspects of the new bureaucratic state that feels extremely tied to the archipelago. It literally is the Bureau of Kami Matters, or the Bureau of Kami Affairs, the Kami no Tsukasa. It would even come to be ranked above the Council of State in the official org chart of the government. While the government had national temples and appointed members of the clergy who were responsible for keeping the Buddhist institutions in line with the state, the Jingi Khan was that entity for court ritual and even for interfacing with various shrines around the country. In the 10th century, all the official shrines across the archipelago would be cataloged and assessed a rank and position, with the Ise Shrine in the royal court at the very top of the list. Speaking of the national temples, the 4th month of 680 was when Oama designated the national temples, which we covered in episode 142. On the first day of the month after that, we are told that he bestowed gifts of silk and cloth to 24 temples around the capital. And if there really were 24 temples just around the capital itself, one can imagine why they had to put a stop to publicly funding all of them. That really must have been quite the upkeep and a drain on the coffers of the state. Now, that same day, the Golden Light Sutra was expounded in the palace and at select temples as well. As we've seen, the court relied just as heavily or more so on Buddhism for certain rituals and providing spiritual power. While both kami-based rituals and Buddhism were revered for their ability to affect the supernatural, Buddhist priests seem to have had a particularly revered place in, or perhaps more rightly outside, of society. One is more likely to hear about someone who was a Buddhist priest or a novice being revered than a kannushi or shrine priest. For example, in the 7th month of 680, the priest Kocho of Asukadera passed away. The royal princes Otsu and Takechi were sent to express royal condolence. Later that same year, we would see something similar, with royal, later crown prince Kusakabe visiting the eminent priest Emyo on his deathbed. Emyo died the next day, and the 3 royal princes were sent to offer the condolences on behalf of the entire royal family. Towards the end of 680, Oama fell ill. 100 individuals were made to take holy orders on his behalf, after which he appears to have recovered, or at least recovered enough for the time. Earlier in the month, his queen, Uno no Sarara, had taken ill, for which Oama had pledged to build Yakushiji, a temple of the medicine Buddha. Once again, something we talked about in episode 142, given that Yakushiji became one of those national temples. Although Oama temporarily recovered, we have mentioned how there are plenty of suggestions that he may not have been entirely better or entirely healthy. It could just be that time and numerous diseases were taking a toll, or perhaps he had an ailment that came and went. I get that impression particularly from things like in the 10th month of 685, as autumn changed to winter, several nobles were sent to Shinano to build a temporary palace in preparation for a royal progress. It seems that Oama wanted to visit the hot springs of Tsukama. Tsukama may have been located on the outskirts of modern Matsumoto City in Nagano, which is known for its hot springs today. Bentley implies that the court was not entirely thrilled with Oama taking this journey, and I have to wonder whether or not this was all about Oama's health. For one, hot springs were often seen as restorative, so one could understand why he might want to go, but at the same time, this sounds like a fairly long journey into the mountains as the weather was growing colder. That also may have been part of the draw, however, allowing them to travel and see the changing leaves, a very common pastime in successive centuries and even today. I can't help but imagine that Oama was seeking the restorative properties while his court may have been apprehensive about the journey there and back as the days were getting colder and Oama was not getting any younger. Compare this to his actions at the start of the Jinshin no Ran when he made that incredible dash from Yoshino through the mountains over to Owari. But that was well over a decade ago at this point, and he seems not quite so spry as he once had been. Another popular record that we find in this reign were various oddities and omens. Now, we've covered quite a few, but I did want to cover a few more before we pull the curtain close on this era. First off, early in the reign, we see a record in the 10th month of 675 for a woman in the district of Takakura in the province of Sagami giving birth to triplets. A quick internet search suggests that natural triplets occur in about 1 in every 8,000 or 10,000 births. However, there is another thing to consider at this particular time in history. Giving birth to a single child was already a risky business, and death during or just after childbirth was a constant threat. So now consider the issues with giving birth to twins or even triplets. The odds that there is a complication just go up at that point. So I suspect that this was a very rare occurrence. The fact that it was 3 sons was probably also seen as particularly auspicious, at least for those who were studying traditional Confucian scholarship and immersed in the patriarchal system of the time. Moving on to the 4th day of the 4th lunar month of that same year, we get an omen for the court. First is a rooster or cock sent to the court by Wanitsumi no Yogoto from the lower Sofu district in Yamato province. This rooster is said to have had a comb like a camellia flower, which was apparently quite auspicious. On the other hand, a report came in from Akunami, also in Yamato province, about a hen that had turned into a rooster. Aston, of course, considers that this would have been an ominous sign, a disruption of the natural order. To be honest, I don't see any particular judgment placed on it one way or the other. It is just listed as a wondrous or miraculous occurrence. The year 678 has remarkably few events in total, with nothing recorded between the 4th and 9th month. And the 9th month was just a note about the death of Prince Wakasa, a prince of the 3rd princely rank. The month after that, we have another one of those strange occurrences. This time, it is a report of something falling from the sky like silk floss, except that it was 5 or 6 feet long and 7 or 8 inches wide. It supposedly floated on the wind and waved from the fir woods and the reed plains. People who saw it called it kanro, or sweet nectar. This really is a crazy and bizarre entry. I've racked my brains to think of a natural event that could cause something like this, but this seems like something that was more like a rumor that got written down. Kanro is thought to be something that Buddhist texts refer to as Amrita, an elixir of immortality. In continental lore, it is said to be sweet nectar that forms when yin and yang are in harmony, such as during a benevolent rain. So whatever the truth of any natural event, to the chroniclers, the entry is clearly a chance to hype up Owama's reign. And then towards the end of the 8th month, we see Katsura no Miyatsuko no Oshikatsu presenting auspicious stalks of grain. Reportedly, they all came from different plots and yet had very similar ears of grain. I think meant a lot more to people who were a lot more invested in grain than we probably are today. Now, auspicious stalks of rice weren't uncommon, but Aston suggests that this was possibly an allegory for all of the royal princes who were brought together in Yoshino to swear support to each other. The 8th month may have been when the grain was harvested, because it wasn't until the final month of the year that we see the court reacting. At that point, presents were made to the royal and non-royal princes, the ministers, and the public functionaries, all according to rank, in consequence of the auspicious stalks of grain. In addition, there was an amnesty for all offenses from capital crimes on down. Now, on top of all that, there were a few edicts that touched on various topics that we just haven't gotten to elsewhere. For instance, in the 8th month of 681, on the 10th day, we see a notification to all the people in the archipelago who claim descent from those on the continent, specifically those from the Korean Peninsula or the Samhan. They were told that the taxes, which had previously been remitted for 10 years, so starting in 671, had come to an end. However, corvée labor was still remitted for 10 years to them and their children and grandchildren who had been with them when they first arrived. There are some questions about this passage, but in general, it seems that those refugees who had escaped to the archipelago from Baekje and Goguryeo had previously been given 10 years from the time they arrived, during which they did not owe taxes. This included corvée labor, which also extended to any children that had been with them at that time. Children that were born after that, well, they wouldn't really be of age to be used as corvée labor in 10 years, so this only would really apply to those who were with them at the time and who would be of age within that 10-year time frame. This exemption from taxes appears several times in different forms and appears to be a grace period during which time the people were expected to establish themselves, open fields, and begin to thrive. At the end of 10 years, then they would start paying taxes with the assumption that they had more than enough time to prepare and work the land. Moving on to one of my favorite entries, on the 18th day of the 9th lunar month of 685, Owama declared a game day. He had the princes and ministers gather at the Oandono, the great audience hall, and had them play a game called Pakugi or Bakugi. We aren't quite sure what the rules were. It probably wasn't Settlers of Catan, but you never know. It was likely a game with dice, possibly a version of backgammon, which is quite old and commonly known as a game for gambling. That same day, Owama gave out gifts of robes and trousers to 10 princes and others. I assume that was related to the gaming session. Now, the history of games and gaming is particularly fascinating. For one thing, many of the games that were played in the archipelago had come from the continent, and many had variants that had traversed the entirety of Eurasia. Backgammon and chess were both games that had variants that would be known in Japan. Backgammon was known as Sugoroku, and in Japan they played a game similar to chess known as shogi. They would also play Go, or more appropriately, Ego, from at least the Nara period, though that game, invented in what is now China, does not appear to have spread quite as much as either backgammon or chess variants. And while chess was a game that was often highly localized, with different pieces representing different things, often moving in different ways depending on the variant, backgammon seems to have been quite similar everywhere and could probably be played by two people with wildly different cultural backgrounds with very little interpretation needed. The day after Owama had the court join his game, there were more presents. This time it was brown bear hides given to the royal and non-royal princes. In total, there were 48 hides given out, which is really pretty incredible. I have this image in my mind of a very Asuka-era wooden mansion with wood and bronze and silk, and then a large bear hide sprawled out on the floor. I'm not sure exactly how they were used, but I suspect that they were mostly used as floor coverings for people to sit or lay on, though I could also see them being used as sleeping mats. Seems they were clearly elite status goods, but hardly what we think about in this period, or really when we think about Japan at all. And with that, we're going to bring the reign to a close. There are only a few more things that we'll get to, but they are all related to what happened with the events surrounding Owama's death and the succession that followed. So we'll touch on those when we kick off the next reign. Till then, remember, if you like what we're doing, please tell your friends and feel free to rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. If you feel the need to do more and want to help us keep this thing going, we have information about how you can donate on Patreon or through our coffee site, ko-fi.com/Sengoku Daimyo, or find the links over at our main website, sengokudaimyo.com/podcast, where we will have some more discussion on topics from this episode. Also, feel free to reach out to our Sengoku Daimyo Facebook page. You can also email us at thesengokudaimyo@gmail.com. Thank you also to Ellen for their work editing the podcast. That's all for now. Thank you again, and I'll see you next episode on Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan.